The merchant ship Providence cleaved through Charleston harbor's grey waters on the morning of March 14, 1764, carrying sugar, rum, indigo, and a woman who would unravel 3 bloodlines before the decade's end. Captain Rousseau stood at the bow, watching the city's church steeples pierce the dawn like accusatory fingers. He'd made this crossing from Saint-Domingue 17 times, but never had his cargo troubled him like the woman chained in the hold. She hadn't spoken once during the 3-week voyage, hadn't wept, hadn't begged. She simply existed with an intensity that made grown men avoid her gaze. "Sir," his quartermaster had whispered 2 days prior, "the men won't go below anymore. They say she watches them. Even when she's sleeping, they swear her eyes follow." Rousseau had struck the man for superstition, but he'd felt it too, that peculiar weight in the air around her, like the pressure before lightning strikes. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. Charleston spread before them now, magnificent and grotesque. White mansions gleamed along the battery, built on rice and human misery. The harbour stank of salt, tar, and the particular sourness of an auction day. On the docks, enslaved people moved cargo, while merchants tallied their fortunes in ledgers bound in calfskin. This was the richest port in the American colonies. More enslaved Africans passed through Charleston than any other city north of Havana. Here, human beings were inventory. Here, suffering had a market price. And here, Jeanne would exact a reckoning that would echo through generations. The Delacroix family mansion stood at 47 East Battery Street, a 3-story Georgian masterpiece of Charleston brick and marble. Its gardens rolling down to the sea wall, where waves crashed against the foundations of old Charleston. From the 3rd-floor window, Madame Céleste Delacroix watched the Providence dock with ivory opera glasses pressed to her pale face. "She arrives today, then," she murmured to her reflection. Her husband, Philippe Delacroix, had arranged the purchase through his contacts in Saint-Domingue. "A gift," he'd called it. "The finest house slave in the Caribbean. Educated, trained in the French manner. She'll elevate our household above the Beaumonts and Montroses combined." But Philippe didn't know what Céleste knew. He hadn't heard the whispers that followed Jeanne from plantation to plantation across the islands. He didn't know that 5 men had died by their own hands after owning her. He couldn't see what Céleste saw even now through her opera glasses, that some people carry devastation in their very bones. The woman being led from the ship moved with an uncanny grace despite her chains. Even at this distance, even through the distortion of morning light, Céleste could see the impossible symmetry of her face, the way dock workers stopped mid-task to stare, the way even the gulls seemed to circle lower. "God have mercy," Céleste whispered. "Philippe, what have you brought into our home?" Charleston's slave market operated with the efficiency of any successful business. The Vendu range on East Bay Street processed human cargo with the same meticulous attention merchants gave to sugar and tobacco. But today, the usual rhythms faltered. Jeanne stood on the auction platform at precisely 11 o'clock, and the crowd fell silent. She wore a simple linen shift stained from the voyage. Her wrists bore the marks of recent shackles. Her feet were bare against the worn wood. By every measure, she should have been unremarkable. Another beautiful woman in a city that consumed beauty like it consumed rum and rice. But there was something in the way she held herself, something in the absolute stillness of her posture. She didn't cringe from the appraising stares of potential buyers, didn't lower her gaze in the submissive manner enslaved people learned to survive. Instead, she looked directly at each man in the crowd, one after another, with eyes the color of aged whiskey catching sunlight. And each man, meeting that gaze, felt something break inside himself. "Gentlemen," the auctioneer began, his usual bravado faltering, "direct from Saint-Domingue, aged approximately 22 years. Trained in household management, French and English languages, needlework. Where are her papers? Interrupted Nathaniel Beaumont, patriarch of the Beaumont shipping empire. He was 63 years old, married 40 years to the same woman, father to 7 children, grandfather to 12. He was known throughout Charleston as a man of iron principle and colder business sense. He would be ruined within 6 months. The auctioneer shuffled through documents. Previous owner deceased, sir. Estate sale. All documentation in order. How did he die? Called Richard Montrose from the back of the crowd. The Montrose family controlled half the rice plantations in the Low Country. Richard was 38, handsome in the way wealthy men often are, married to a woman he ignored, and bored with every pleasure Charleston could offer. He would be found wandering the docks in a year's time, mind shattered, whispering a name no one could make him stop saying. The auctioneer cleared his throat. The previous owner's death was natural causes, gentlemen. Now shall we begin the bidding at— I'll pay whatever Beaumont offers, plus 20%, said a voice from the platform's edge. Every head turned. Philippe Delacroix had appeared from the crowd like a spirit, his face flushed with something between desire and terror. He was staring at Jeanne with the expression of a man who'd just seen his entire future collapse and rebuild itself into a new and terrible shape. "The woman is mine," Philippe said quietly. "I purchased her before she left Saint-Domingue. I'm here merely to collect my property." Beaumont stepped forward, hands clenched. "Your property? By what authority?" "By the authority of gold, Nathaniel. The same authority you respect above all others." Philippe produced papers from his coat. "Signed, sealed, and witnessed. The woman belongs to the Delacroix household." For a moment the two patriarchs faced each other across the crowded platform, and every person present understood they were witnessing something more than a commercial dispute. This was the opening move in a war that would consume Charleston's elite. And through it all, Jeanne stood silent, her amber eyes moving from one man to the next, with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been something darker, something older, something that had been waiting a very long time for this particular moment in this particular city. The ride from Vendu Range to East Battery took 12 minutes. Philippe sat across from Jeanne in the enclosed carriage, studying her with the intensity of a naturalist examining a new species. "You understand English," he said, not a question. "Yes, monsieur." Her voice was low, melodic, with an accent that carried hints of France and Africa and something else, something that didn't quite fit any geography Philippe knew. "And French?" "Oui, monsieur." "You're educated. Unusual for—" He trailed off, suddenly uncomfortable with the implications of his own observation. "For a slave?" Jeanne's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Yes, unusual." Philippe shifted in his seat. The carriage suddenly felt smaller. "Your previous owner, how did he die?" "By his own hand, monsieur. He hanged himself in the cane fields at dawn. They found him swinging between the rows, face purple, tongue black." She delivered this information with the same tone one might use to describe the weather. The overseer said he was smiling. The carriage hit a rut. Philippe grabbed the leather strap to steady himself, but Jeanne didn't move. She remained perfectly balanced, perfectly still, as if the laws of physics didn't quite apply to her in the same way they applied to everyone else. "And before him?" Philippe asked, though every instinct screamed at him to stop asking questions. "Before him, there was Monsieur Levesque. He walked into the ocean one morning and kept walking until the water closed over his head. Before him was Monsieur Duchamp, who purchased a pistol and shot himself in the mouth during Sunday Mass. Before him—" "Enough!" Philippe's voice cracked. "Why are you telling me this?" Jeanne met his eyes fully for the first time. In the dim carriage light, her irises seemed to shift color, amber to gold to something deeper and more dangerous. "Because you asked, monsieur, and because you should know what you've purchased." The carriage arrived at the Delacroix mansion. Through the window, Philippe could see his wife waiting on the portico, his son Thomas standing beside her, his daughter Marie peeking from behind the columns. His whole family assembled to greet the new acquisition that would elevate their social standing. They had no idea they were welcoming their own destruction. Jeanne stepped down from the carriage with fluid grace, her bare feet touching the crushed shell drive. She looked up at the mansion's facade, at the Palladian windows and widow's walk, at the wealth built on the backs of people who looked like her. And somewhere deep in her chest, something ancient and patient smiled. "Welcome home, mademoiselle," said the head butler, Samuel, himself enslaved, his voice carefully neutral. Jeanne turned to him. For just a moment, her expression softened into something human, something sad. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm sorry." Samuel frowned, confused. "Sorry for what, miss?" But Jeanne was already moving toward the house, following Madame Celeste through the grand entrance, disappearing into the shadows of the foyer. Samuel stood on the drive, feeling suddenly cold despite the warm March afternoon. He couldn't have explained why, but he knew with absolute certainty that something terrible had just crossed the threshold of 47 East Battery Street. Something that had been waiting centuries for this moment. Something that would burn Charleston's elite families to ash before it was finished. Jeanne stood at the window of her small room on the 3rd floor, looking out over Charleston Harbor. The city spread below her like a jeweled necklace. Beautiful and obscene, wealth and misery existing side by side with the casual cruelty that defined the American colonies in 1764. She'd been given a room to herself, another sign of her elevated status within the household hierarchy. The other enslaved people whispered about it, about her. She'd heard them in the hallways, seen them cross themselves when she passed. They were afraid. Good. Fear was honest. Fear recognized truth when it stood before you in human form. From her pocket, Jeanne withdrew a small cloth bundle. Inside was a lock of hair, grey and brittle, cut from the head of her mother on the day they'd been separated at auction in Port-au-Prince. Jeanne had been 7 years old. She could still remember her mother's last words, whispered in a language the traders didn't understand. Remember, remember everything. Let them think you're broken. Learn their ways, learn their weaknesses, and when the time comes, show them what justice looks like. Jeanne had remembered. For 15 years she'd moved through the households of the wealthy, watching, learning, understanding the specific architecture of their cruelty. She'd discovered something remarkable. Powerful men were remarkably easy to destroy. Their pride made them blind. Their desire made them stupid. Their certainty that they were owed the world made them incapable of recognizing danger until it had already consumed them. She tucked the lock of hair back into her pocket and turned from the window. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow, she would start dismantling the Delacroix family with the same methodical precision they'd used to build their fortune on human suffering. And when the Delacroix fell, the Beaumonts and Montroses would watch and think themselves safe. They would be wrong. Jeanne lay down on the narrow bed, closed her eyes, and dreamed of fire. 3 weeks passed at the Delacroix mansion, and Charleston's spring humidity settled over the city like a wet blanket. The azaleas bloomed along East Battery, their pink and white flowers masking the rot that festered beneath the elegant facades of the great houses. Jeanne moved through her duties with silent efficiency. She served tea in the morning parlor, arranged flowers in the grand hallway, helped Madame Celeste dress for her afternoon social calls. To any observer, she was simply another well-trained house slave, performing her role with quiet competence. But the house itself had begun to change. It started with small things. Philippe Delacroix found himself unable to sleep. He would lie awake until dawn, staring at the canopy above his bed, listening to the house settle and creak, imagining footsteps in the hallway that never materialized. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were filled with images he couldn't quite remember upon waking, only the lingering sense of having witnessed something terrible. Celeste noticed that mirrors throughout the house seemed darker somehow, as if a film of dust covered them, no matter how often the servants cleaned. She would catch glimpses of movement in the corners of her vision, turn to look, and find nothing there. The grandfather clock in the foyer began chiming at irregular intervals, sometimes striking 13 times at midnight. Their son Thomas, 19 years old and home from his studies in Virginia, became obsessed with watching Jeanne work. He would follow her from room to room, finding excuses to be wherever she was, his eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that bordered on madness. He stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping. His friends came to call and found him distracted, answering questions that hadn't been asked, laughing at things that weren't funny. "Your son is unwell," Celeste told Philippe one evening as they prepared for bed. "He needs a physician. Thomas is fine. He's simply adjusting to being home." Philippe's voice was sharp, defensive. He'd been drinking more lately, she noticed. The decanter in his study was always half empty by evening. "He watches that woman constantly. It's not natural." Philippe's jaw tightened. "She's a slave, Celeste. A piece of property. Thomas can look at her as much as he likes. That's what concerns me." Celeste moved to the window, looking out over the darkened garden. "She doesn't act like property. Have you noticed? She never flinches, never shows fear. When you give her orders, she obeys, but there's something in her eyes, like she's merely choosing to comply, like she could choose otherwise if she wished." "You're imagining things." "Am I?" "Philippe, what do you know about this woman? Really know? You said she was from a reputable household in Saint-Domingue, but you've never told me which one. You've never told me why she was sold. You've never—" "Enough!" Philippe's shout echoed through the bedroom. He immediately looked ashamed of his outburst. "I'm sorry, I'm tired. These negotiations with the Beaumonts have been exhausting." Celeste didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that her husband kept secrets. Every successful man in Charleston kept secrets. But this felt different. This felt dangerous. That night she dreamed of fire. The Delacroix family hosted a dinner party on the last Saturday in April. It was an important event, designed to showcase their refined taste and elevated social position. The guest list included the most prominent families in Charleston: the Beaumonts, the Rutledges, the Pinckneys, and yes, the Montroses. Jeanne worked in the background, serving wine, clearing plates, invisible in the way enslaved people were trained to be. But every man in the room tracked her movements. Conversations faltered when she passed. Glasses were drained too quickly and refilled too often. Richard Montrose, seated between his wife Eleanor and Philippe Delacroix, couldn't take his eyes off her. He'd seen beautiful women before, Charleston was full of them, but this was something else entirely. Something that bypassed reason and struck directly at whatever primitive part of the brain still believed in magic. "Delacroix," he said quietly, leaning toward his host, "where did you acquire that girl?" Philippe's hand tightened on his wineglass. "Saint-Domingue. Why?" "I'd like to make you an offer. Name your price." "She's not for sale." "Everything's for sale, Philippe. You taught me that yourself." Richard's smile was predatory. £10,000 right now. I'll have my banker draft the note tomorrow." Around them, conversation had stopped. Every man at the table was listening now, their attention focused on this negotiation, like wolves watching a kill. "Gentlemen," Celeste said brightly, desperately trying to rescue the evening's decorum, "shall we retire to the drawing room for cordials?" But the moment had already shifted into something darker. Nathaniel Beaumont stood, his chair scraping against the floor with an ugly sound. "20,000, he said. "I'll pay £20,000 for the girl." The room erupted. Women gasped, men shouted. Philippe rose to his feet, face flushed with rage and something else, something that looked like fear. She is not for sale. His voice cut through the chaos. She belongs to this house, to this family, and no amount of gold will change that. Richard Montrose smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd just found a weakness to exploit. Interesting, very interesting indeed. The party ended early. Guests made their excuses and departed into the warm April night, their carriages clattering away over the cobblestones. But the damage was done. Word would spread through Charleston like fever. The Delacroix family possessed something valuable enough to make grown men abandon propriety, something worth £20,000, something dangerous. Jeanne cleaned the dining room after everyone had gone. She moved methodically through the debris of the evening, wine-stained tablecloths, half-eaten desserts, crystal glasses still bearing the lip prints of Charleston's elite. Through the window she could see the harbour, dark water reflecting scattered stars. "Why do you do this?" She turned. Thomas Delacroix stood in the doorway, still dressed in his dinner clothes. His cravat loosened. He'd been drinking. She could smell the brandy from across the room. "Do what, sir?" "This." He gestured vaguely at the room, at her, at everything. "You're not like the others. The other slaves, I mean. They're broken, defeated. But you—" He stepped closer. "You're like a coiled spring, like something waiting to be released." Jeanne set down the silver she'd been polishing. "You should go to bed, Master Thomas. You're drunk. Don't tell me what to do." But there was no real anger in his voice, only desperation. "Everyone in this house tells me what to do. My father, my mother, even the servants in their way, but not you. You don't care about any of us, do you?" "I'm a slave, sir. What I care about doesn't matter." "That's not true." Thomas was standing very close now. "I see how you look at us, at this house, at everything we've built. You despise us." Jeanne met his eyes. For the first time since arriving at the Delacroix mansion, she let him see the truth of what she felt. The contempt, the rage, the patient, terrible certainty that she would watch this family destroy itself. Thomas stumbled backward as if physically struck. "You're right to be afraid," Jeanne said softly. "You should tell your father to sell me, tomorrow, to anyone who'll take me. Send me as far from Charleston as possible." "Why?" Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. "What are you?" Jeanne smiled. It was not a kind expression. "I'm what you made me, all of you. Every master who thought he owned me. Every mistress who looked through me like I was furniture. Every overseer who thought my pain didn't matter because the color of my skin gave him permission." She paused. "I'm the bill coming due, Master Thomas. And the interest has been compounding for a very long time." Thomas ran. She heard his footsteps pounding up the stairs, heard his bedroom door slam shut. She returned to cleaning, humming an old song her mother had taught her, a song about justice, about patience. But the day when the scales would finally balance. That night, Thomas Delacroix had the first of the dreams that would eventually drive him mad. He dreamed of drowning in an ocean made of amber-colored eyes. He dreamed of chains that wrapped around his chest until he couldn't breathe. He dreamed of his father and Beaumont and Montrose, all standing in a circle while something burned in the center, something that screamed with his voice. He woke at dawn, sheets soaked with sweat, and knew with absolute certainty that something terrible had begun. Something that would not stop until every person in this house had paid for sins they didn't even know they'd committed. Downstairs, Jeanne stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun rise over Charleston Harbor. She touched the lock of her mother's hair through the fabric of her dress. "Soon," she whispered to the memory, "soon they'll understand. Soon they'll all understand." The first crack in the Delacroix family had appeared. It was small, barely visible, like the hairline fracture in a foundation stone. But Jeanne knew something about cracks. She knew they spread. She knew they widened. She knew that given time and pressure, even the strongest structures could collapse into dust. And she had all the time in the world. May arrived with oppressive heat. Charleston sweltered under a sun that seemed angrier than in previous years, beating down on the city like divine punishment. The Ashley and Cooper rivers ran low, and in the rice fields surrounding the city, enslaved workers collapsed from heatstroke with disturbing regularity. Nathaniel Beaumont stood in his office on Broad Street, looking down at the commercial district where he'd built his empire. Ships bearing his company's colours filled the harbour. Warehouses stamped with his mark lined the docks. He controlled more tonnage than any merchant in the American colonies, and his wealth exceeded that of many European nobles. But none of it mattered anymore. Nothing mattered except the woman at 47 East Battery Street. He'd tried to forget her. God knows he'd tried. He'd thrown himself into work, reviewing manifests and negotiating contracts until his eyes blurred. He'd attended church services with his wife Margaret, sitting through sermons about resisting temptation and keeping one's thoughts pure. He'd spent evenings with his grandchildren, bouncing the youngest on his knee while the older ones recited their lessons. And every moment, Jeanne's face haunted him, those amber eyes, that devastating stillness. The way she'd looked at him during the dinner party, as if she could see every sin he'd ever committed, every cruelty he'd inflicted in the name of profit, every moment of suffering his fortune had been built upon. "Sir?" His clerk, Samuel Hutchins, stood in the doorway with a ledger. "The reports from the Angola shipment. You asked to review them?" Nathaniel didn't turn from the window. "Tell me, Samuel, do you believe in curses?" Hutchins blinked. In 15 years of service, his employer had never asked such a question. I suppose I believe in God's judgment, sir, if that's what you mean." "Not God's judgment. Something older. Something that existed before churches and priests and scripture." Nathaniel finally turned. He looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept in days. What if there were people who carried divine retribution in their very blood, people who'd been wronged so thoroughly that the universe itself bent toward giving them vengeance? "Mr. Beaumont, are you feeling well?" "Answer the question, damn you!" Hutchins set down the ledger carefully. "I think, sir, that you've been working too hard. Perhaps you should go home. Rest, spend time with your family." But Nathaniel couldn't go home. Home meant lying next to Margaret and feeling like a stranger in his own bed. Home meant looking at his children and seeing the disappointment in their eyes when they realized their father's attention was elsewhere. Home meant confronting the slowly spreading awareness that everything he'd built, everything he'd accomplished had become meaningless. He needed to see Jeanne again. Needed it like a drowning man needs air. "Prepare my carriage," he said. "I'm calling on the Delacroix family." Philippe Delacroix received Beaumont in his study, a masculine room of dark wood and leather that smelled of tobacco and old money. He did not offer his guest a seat. "This is unexpected," Philippe said coldly. "I don't recall us having business to discuss." "We don't. This isn't a business call." Beaumont removed his hat, turning it in his hands like a nervous suitor. "I want to purchase your slave, the woman from Saint-Domingue. I told you at the dinner party, £30,000. Beaumont's voice was steady, but his hands trembled. "That's more than you paid for this entire house, more than most men see in a lifetime. Think about what you could do with that kind of capital, new ships, new ventures. You could expand into territories the Beaumonts have dominated for decades." Philippe studied his visitor with something approaching pity. "You don't understand, do you? It's not about money anymore. Then what is it about? Control." Philippe poured himself a whiskey, didn't offer one to Beaumont. "That woman is the most valuable asset in Charleston, and not because of what she can do, because of what she represents. Power, status. Every man in this city wants her, which means I have something every man in this city wants. Do you understand how intoxicating that is?" Beaumont's face darkened. "You're playing with fire, Delacroix." "Am I? Or am I simply the only one smart enough to hold on to what I have?" Philippe sipped his drink. "You should go home to your wife, your grandchildren. Forget about this obsession before it destroys you." I'll pay £50,000. The words hung in the air like a curse. Philippe's glass stopped halfway to his lips. What did you say? £50,000 gold, delivered to any bank you name. Beaumont stepped forward. I'll sign over 2 of my ships, the Merchant's Pride and the Atlantic Rose. I'll give you exclusive contracts for all my rice exports next season. His voice cracked. I'll give you anything, everything. Just name your price. Philippe set down his glass with exaggerated care. Get out of my house. Philippe, get out before I have you thrown out. Beaumont stood frozen for a moment, and Philippe saw something flicker across the older man's face. Rage, certainly, but also something else. Something that looked like desperation tinged with madness. This isn't over, Beaumont said quietly. That woman will be mine, one way or another. After Beaumont left, Philippe remained in his study, staring at nothing. £50,000, 2 ships, exclusive contracts. The offer would have bankrupted Beaumont, left him a shell of his former self, all for a single enslaved woman. What was happening to Charleston's elite? What had Jeanne done to these men? Father? Thomas stood in the doorway, pale and shaking. He looked terrible, dark circles under bloodshot eyes, clothes hanging loose on a frame that had lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. What is it? Philippe's patience was worn thin. You need to sell her, tonight. I don't care who to or for how much. She needs to leave this house. Not you too. Thomas, she's just a slave. She's not. Thomas's shout echoed through the study. She's something else, something wrong. Every night I dream about her. Every night I see things, terrible things, fire and blood, and... He grabbed his father's arm. She's going to destroy us, all of us. Can't you feel it? Philippe jerked his arm away. Control yourself. You sound like a madman. Maybe I am mad. Maybe that's what she does. Maybe that's her gift, driving men mad until they destroy themselves. Thomas laughed, high and brittle. Beaumont will be next. You saw how he looked. Then Montrose, then you, father. One by one we'll all fall, and she'll just watch with those eyes that see everything, that judge everything, that... Enough, Philippe slapped his son. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Go to your room. Sleep off whatever's gotten into you. In the morning you'll apologize for this hysteria. Thomas touched his reddening cheek, and for a moment Philippe saw his son clearly, saw the terror and exhaustion and something else, something that might have been prophecy. She warned me, Thomas whispered, that first night. She told me you should sell her, send her far away, but you won't, will you? Your pride won't let you, and that's exactly what she's counting on. He left without another word. Philippe stood alone in his study, listening to the house settle around him, and felt for the first time the cold touch of doubt. That evening, Nathaniel Beaumont did not go home to his wife and grandchildren. Instead, he sat in a tavern on East Bay Street, drinking rum and staring at nothing while the evening crowd swirled around him. "You look like a man with troubles," said a voice beside him. Beaumont looked up. A stranger had taken the next stool, a thin man with grey hair and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. He smelled of salt and tar, like someone who'd spent a lifetime at sea. "My troubles are my own," Beaumont said. "As you like." The stranger ordered rum, but I've seen that look before, in Saint-Domingue, in Jamaica, in every port where slaves are traded like cattle. He sipped his drink. It's the look of a man who's met someone from the old world. The real old world, before your churches and laws and pretty manners tried to bury it. Despite himself, Beaumont leaned closer. "What do you mean?" "There are some among the enslaved who remember, who carry in their blood the knowledge of what was taken, who were taught by mothers and grandmothers that justice isn't something you beg for from masters. It's something you take." The stranger's eyes glinted in the tavern's dim light. "They're rare. Most break under the weight of bondage. But a few," he smiled, "a few become something else entirely. You're talking about the Delacroix woman." "Am I?" "I didn't mention any names." The stranger stood, dropping coins on the bar. But here's some advice, free of charge. Stay away from her. Whatever you think you want, whatever you think you're willing to pay, it's not worth what she'll cost you. I can't stay away. I've tried. Then God have mercy on you, because she won't. The stranger moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. When she's finished with Charleston, when all three families have fallen, she'll vanish like smoke. They always do. And years later, someone else will buy a beautiful slave woman with amber eyes, and the whole dance will start again. It's happened before. It'll happen again. That's the nature of debts this old. They never really get settled. They just get paid forward, one generation at a time. He disappeared into the night, leaving Beaumont alone with his thoughts and his increasingly empty rum glass. At the Delacroix mansion, Jeanne sat in her small room, writing a letter by candlelight. The paper was smuggled, the ink borrowed, but the words flowed easily. She was writing to someone in Boston, someone who would understand what she was doing and why. Someone who was doing the same thing in a different city, to different families, for the same eternal cause. The first family cracks. The son sees clearly, but speaks madly, so none believe him. The father's pride will be his undoing. The second family's patriarch offered everything, ships, gold, contracts, all for one woman. He doesn't understand he's not buying me. He's buying his own destruction. The third family's turn comes soon. Richard Montrose thinks himself immune because he's young and clever. He doesn't know that clever men fall hardest. They see the trap and walk into it anyway, convinced they're different. Convinced they're special. Mother would be proud. I remember her lessons. I remember everything. She sealed the letter with stolen wax, marked it with a symbol that looked like a knot but wasn't, an old sign from the islands, one that meant justice deferred but never forgotten. Tomorrow she would give it to Samuel the butler, who would pass it to a free black sailor, who would carry it north on a ship that wouldn't ask questions. And somewhere in Boston, another woman with amber eyes would read it and smile, knowing she wasn't alone in this patient, terrible work. Jeanne extinguished the candle and lay in darkness, listening to the house breathe around her. She could hear Thomas pacing in his room above, could hear Philippe arguing with Celeste in their bedroom, could hear faintly the sound of the city beyond the walls, Charleston, beautiful and damned, sitting on foundations built from human suffering. The reckoning had begun, and it would not stop until every brick of every great house had been reduced to ash and memory. She closed her eyes and dreamed of her mother's face, of her mother's voice, teaching her in a language the masters didn't know, of her mother's final words, whispered on an auction block in Port-au-Prince. They think they own you. Let them believe it. But remember, the enslaved always outnumber the enslavers. We just haven't decided to remind them yet. Soon, Jeanne thought. Soon Charleston would remember. Soon they would all remember. And the memory would burn like fire. June brought Charleston its worst heat in living memory. The city sweltered under a sun that seemed to have moved closer to earth, turning cobblestone streets into surfaces that burn through shoe leather and transforming elegant drawing rooms into ovens despite closed shutters and desperate fanning. People said it was a punishment, God's judgment on a city built on wickedness. But the truly superstitious whispered something different, that the heat had started when that woman arrived from Saint-Domingue, that her presence had literally raised the temperature of Charleston, that she carried hellfire in her very bones. Richard Montrose didn't believe in superstition. He believed in what he could see, touch, and manipulate to his advantage. At 38, he'd already doubled his inherited fortune through shrewd management of the family's rice plantations and aggressive expansion into new territories. He was handsome in the way wealthy men often are, with good teeth and clear skin, and the confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything he truly wanted. He wanted Jeanne. And unlike Beaumont, Richard Montrose was accustomed to getting what he wanted. His wife Eleanor sat across from him at breakfast, pushing eggs around her plate without eating. She'd grown thin lately, her face drawn, her eyes distant. They'd been married 16 years and had produced 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, all of whom were currently at their summer estate on James Island, safely away from the city's heat. "You're going there again today," Eleanor said. "Not a question. I have business with Delacroix. The rice exports." "Don't lie to me, Richard. Not anymore." She set down her fork with exaggerated precision. "You're going to see her, that slave woman, the one all you foolish men have lost your minds over." Richard's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I? The entire city talks of nothing else. Beaumont has mortgaged 3 properties trying to raise funds to buy her. His wife hasn't left her bedroom in 2 weeks. Thomas Delacroix has been seen wandering King Street at midnight, raving to anyone who'll listen about curses and vengeance." Eleanor finally met her husband's eyes. "And you, Richard, you barely sleep, you barely eat. You spend hours at your desk, writing letters you never send. Letters to Philippe Delacroix, I assume. Offers to purchase a woman you've seen exactly once. Twice," Richard corrected without thinking, then cursed himself for the admission. "Twice? Of course." "Forgive my imprecision." Eleanor's voice dripped with bitter amusement. "What is it about her? What makes rational men behave like lovesick fools? Is she really so beautiful?" Richard wanted to explain, wanted to make his wife understand that this wasn't about beauty, not really. Yes, Jeanne was beautiful in the way that certain classical sculptures were beautiful, something about the proportions, the symmetry, the way light caught her features. But that wasn't what had hooked into his chest and wouldn't let go. It was the recognition. When Jeanne looked at him, Richard saw himself reflected in those amber eyes, saw his vanity, his cruelty, his casual destruction of human lives in pursuit of profit. She looked at him and saw exactly what he was, stripped of all the pretty lies he told himself. And somehow, impossibly, he craved that honest judgment the way other men craved wine or opium. "I have to go," he said, standing abruptly. "I'll be home for dinner." "No, you won't." Eleanor rose as well, moving to the window. "You'll go to the Delacroix house. You'll make some excuse to stay. You'll catch glimpses of her as she works. And each glimpse will feel like a knife twisting in your chest. And you'll come home late, drunk, stinking of desperation, and we'll pretend this is normal. That our marriage hasn't become a joke, that you haven't already destroyed us for a woman you've barely spoken to." Richard wanted to argue, wanted to tell his wife she was wrong, but Eleanor had always been too perceptive for comfortable lies. It was one of the things he'd loved about her once. Before Jeanne, before that dinner party, before his life had divided into 2 distinct periods, before and after, he left without another word. His carriage rattled through Charleston's morning streets, past market women selling vegetables and fish, past slaves heading to their day's labor, past churches that promised salvation to a city drowning in sin. The heat was already oppressive at 8 in the morning. By noon it would be unbearable. The Delacroix mansion looked different in daylight, less imposing, more vulnerable. Richard noticed things he'd missed during the evening party. Peeling paint on the northern corner, a cracked window on the 3rd floor, gardens that had grown wild despite having a full staff of enslaved gardeners. The house had an air of decline, as if something essential had begun to rot from within. Philippe received him in the study. The patriarch of the Delacroix family looked terrible, haggard and thin, with the yellowish tint to his skin that suggested liver trouble. On the desk between them sat an empty whiskey decanter and a glass still bearing the residue of last night's drinking. "Montrose, this is a surprise." Philippe's voice was hoarse, scraping. "Is it? I've sent 3 letters requesting a meeting. I've been occupied. These are troubled times." Philippe gestured vaguely at papers scattered across his desk. "Contracts falling through, ships delayed, workers growing restless. It seems everything I touch lately turns to ash." Richard felt a flicker of satisfaction. Good. Let Delacroix suffer. Let him understand the price of holding something that should be shared, or better yet, something that should belong to Richard alone. "I'll be direct," Richard said. "I want to buy your slave, the woman from Saint-Domingue. Name your price." Philippe laughed. It was an ugly sound, bitter and broken. "You're the third person to make me that offer. Beaumont was here yesterday. Before him, Jonathan Rutledge. Before him—" He waved a hand. "It doesn't matter. The answer is the same. She's not for sale. £100,000. The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. Philippe's head snapped up, eyes suddenly sharp despite the evident hangover. "What did you say?" £100,000, plus 20% interest on any loans you currently hold, plus exclusive contracts for your shipping business, plus," Richard leaned forward, "plus my plantation on James Island. The house, the land, the enslaved workers, everything." Philippe stood slowly, bracing himself against the desk. "You're insane. That plantation has been in your family for 3 generations. I don't care. Your wife, I don't care." Richard's voice was flat, emotionless. "I'll divorce Eleanor if necessary, send the children to my brother in Virginia, sell everything I own if that's what it takes. I need that woman Delacroix. Can't you understand? I need her the way I need air. The way I need water. Every day without her feels like drowning." Philippe studied Richard with something approaching horror. "My God, look at yourself. Listen to yourself. This is madness." "Then we're all mad. You, me, Beaumont, half the men in Charleston." Richard's laugh was harsh. "At least I'm honest about it. At least I'm not pretending this is about business or status or control. I want her because I want her, and I'm willing to pay any price to have her." "She's a slave, for God's sake, a piece of property. You can buy a dozen women who look just like her." "No." Richard's voice was quiet now, deadly. "I can't. There's only one of her. Only one person who looks at me and sees what I really am. Only one person whose judgment I actually care about." He paused. "Do you know what that's like, Philippe? To spend your whole life surrounded by people who pretend to respect you, who smile and bow and call you sir, all while knowing they'd slit your throat for half of what you have? And then to meet someone who doesn't pretend, who just sees you, really sees you." Philippe sank back into his chair. "You're describing a slave who hates you, who judges you, who would probably kill you if given the chance. And you're offering to destroy your life to possess her. Yes, then God help you. God help us all." Philippe reached for the whiskey decanter, remembered it was empty, and set it down with a hollow thunk. "The answer is still no. She stays with the Delacroix family." "Then I'll take her." The threat hung in the air. Philippe's hand moved slowly toward the drawer where Richard knew he kept a pistol. But Richard was already standing, moving toward the door. "Don't come back, Montrose. If you set foot on my property again, I'll have you shot." Richard smiled. "No, you won't, because that would start a war between our families, and you're not strong enough for war anymore. Are you, Philippe? Look at yourself. Look at this house. You're falling apart. The question isn't whether I'll have her. The question is whether you'll still be standing when I do." He left the study, moved through the grand hallway, and stopped. Jeanne was there, arranging flowers in a crystal vase. She didn't look up as he approached, simply continued her work with fluid precision. "You know what you're doing," Richard said quietly. "Don't you? This isn't random. This isn't chance. You're destroying us deliberately." Jeanne placed a white rose in the vase, adjusted its angle slightly. "I'm a slave, sir. I do what I'm told." "Liar!" Richard stepped closer. "I've spent my whole life reading people. Knowing when they're bluffing, when they're hiding something, when they're playing a deeper game. You're playing the deepest game I've ever seen. The question is why?" Finally, Jeanne looked at him, and Richard felt the full force of that amber gaze, felt it strip away every defense, every comfortable lie, every pretense of civility. In her eyes, he saw himself as she saw him, a man who'd built his fortune on human suffering, who'd bought and sold people like livestock, who'd never once questioned whether he had that right because questioning would mean confronting the horror of what he'd become. You want to know why? Jeanne's voice was soft, almost gentle. Because you deserve it, all of you. Every master who thought ownership of another human being was his God-given right. Every mistress who looked through us like we were furniture. Every overseer who wielded the whip and slept soundly afterward. She set down the flowers. You want to possess me? You want to own me? You want to break me to your will the way you've broken everyone else? But here's the truth, Mr. Montrose. I was broken 15 years ago. And what you're looking at isn't a woman anymore. It's what's left after breaking. It's the sharp edge, the part that cuts. Richard couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. He stood frozen while Jeanne picked up the vase of flowers and walked past him, her footsteps silent on the marble floor. At the doorway she paused. You offered everything to Philippe, your plantation, your fortune, your family. She glanced back and her smile was terrible. But you forgot the most important thing. You forgot to ask what I would demand. And my price, Mr. Montrose, is higher than you can pay. Whoa! She disappeared into the house's shadowed interior, leaving Richard alone in the hallway. His legs gave out. He found himself on his knees on the cold marble, shaking as the full weight of what he'd done, what he was planning to do, crashed over him like a wave. He'd been willing to destroy his marriage, his children's inheritance, his family's legacy, all for a woman who didn't just hate him, she was vengeance personified. She was every sin he'd committed come back wearing flesh. She was justice with amber eyes and a patient smile. And he still wanted her. God help him, he still wanted her. That night, Richard Montrose did not go home. He went instead to the docks, to a tavern frequented by sailors and dock workers, and men who'd given up pretending they were respectable. He drank rum until the room spun, until the faces around him blurred into a singular mass of humanity. At some point, he started talking. Started telling anyone who'd listen about the woman at the Delacroix mansion, about her eyes, about what she'd said, about the way she looked at him and saw every terrible thing he'd ever done. She's a witch, someone said. They should burn her. She's a slave, someone else countered. They should sell her, send her far away before she destroys every family in Charleston. But an old woman in the corner, a freed slave who sold herbs and told fortunes, laughed at both suggestions. You can't burn justice, she said, and you can't send vengeance away. It follows you, it finds you. It waits as long as it needs to wait, and then it collects what you owe. She looked at Richard with rheumy eyes that still saw clearly. You want my advice, young master? Go home to your wife. Kiss your children, make peace with whatever God you believe in, because that woman at the Delacroix house, she's not a witch, she's not a demon, she's something much simpler and much worse. What is she? Richard whispered. She's what happens when you push people past breaking, when you take everything from them, their freedom, their dignity, their families, and expect them to just endure forever. The old woman spat into the sawdust on the floor. She's the answer to every prayer ever whispered by every slave who ever lived. She's what we become when we stop asking for mercy and start demanding justice. Richard stumbled out of the tavern as dawn broke over Charleston. The heat had already begun building, promising another unbearable day. He made his way back to his house on Trad Street, up the stairs to the bedroom he shared with Eleanor. She was awake, sitting by the window in her nightgown, looking out at the waking city. I'm sorry, Richard said. Eleanor didn't turn. Are you, or are you just sorry you got caught? Both, maybe. I don't know anymore. I don't know anything anymore except... His voice broke. Except I've destroyed us, haven't I? Everything we built, everything we had. I've thrown it all away for something I can never have. Yes. Eleanor's voice was flat. You have. Can you forgive me? Now she did turn, and Richard saw that she'd been crying. Her face was blotchy, her eyes red and swollen. No, I don't think I can. But here's what I can do. I can leave. I can take the children to my sisters in Virginia. I can remove myself from whatever catastrophe you're building toward. And when it all comes crashing down, and it will, Richard, I promise you it will, at least our children won't have to watch their father destroy himself. She stood, moved past him to the door. My carriage leaves at noon. I'll take what I can carry. The rest is yours, all of it. The house, the money, the shame. It's all yours. After she left, Richard sat on the bed in the growing heat and thought about everything he'd lost. His wife, his children, his self-respect, his sanity. All of it sacrificed on the altar of an obsession he couldn't name and couldn't break. And the worst part, the truly terrible part, was that he regretted none of it. If given the choice, he'd do it all again. He'd throw away every bit of what made him human for one more chance to stand in Jeanne's presence, to feel that mixture of terror and recognition, to be truly seen by someone who understood exactly what he was. At the Delacroix mansion, Jeanne stood at her third-floor window, watching the city wake. She'd received word through Samuel that Eleanor Montrose was leaving her husband, that Nathaniel Beaumont had suffered a collapse and been confined to his bed by physicians who couldn't identify what was wrong with him, that Thomas Delacroix had been found trying to set fire to his own bedroom, raving about needing to burn the demon out. The first two families were falling, the third was cracking. And Philippe Delacroix still clung to his possession of her with desperate pride, not understanding that his pride was exactly what she'd been counting on. Soon now, very soon, the foundation stones were loose. The walls were cracking, one more push, and the whole structure would collapse. Jeanne touched the lock of her mother's hair, whispered a prayer in a language older than English or French or any of the colonial tongues, a prayer for patience, for precision, for the perfect moment when justice would finally be served. Charleston's heat continued to build, and somewhere in the city, Richard Montrose decided he couldn't wait any longer. He would have Jeanne, whatever the cost. He would take her from the Delacroix mansion by force, if necessary. He would, but Jeanne was already 3 moves ahead. She'd always been 3 moves ahead. Because that's what 15 years of patience had taught her. Not just to see the board, but to control it so completely that her opponents thought their moves were their own choices. They were wrong. They'd never had any choices at all. The trap had been set the moment she walked off that ship. Now it was just a matter of waiting for everyone to spring it on themselves. July arrived with violence. Not the slow heat of June, but something more aggressive. Storms that rolled in from the Atlantic with lightning that cracked the sky and thunder that shook foundations. Charleston residents muttered that the weather itself had gone mad, that the very air tasted wrong, that something fundamental had shifted in the fabric of their world. They were right, though they didn't yet understand why. The Delacroix mansion showed visible signs of decay now. Paint peeled in long strips. Shutters hung crooked on rusted hinges. The gardens had become a wilderness, overgrown with vines that seemed to strangle everything they touched. Servants whispered and made signs against evil when they thought no one was watching. Several had fled in the night, preferring uncertain freedom to remaining in a house that felt cursed. Philippe Delacroix had aged 20 years in 3 months. His skin had taken on a greyish cast. His hands shook constantly. He spent his days in the study, doors locked, drinking whiskey and writing letters he never sent, offers to sell Jeanne, pleas for forgiveness to creditors he'd neglected, rambling confessions of sins, both real and imagined. Celeste had retreated to her bedroom and refused to come out. Through the door, servants could hear her praying in French. The same desperate phrases repeated until they lost all meaning. Sometimes she screamed, sometimes she laughed. Mostly, there was just silence. The terrible silence of someone who'd stopped fighting, and Thomas. Thomas had been committed to the Charleston asylum for the mad after he'd tried to strangle his father while screaming about demons and fire and judgment. He'd been found 3 days later, having escaped his restraints, huddled in the chapel and carving symbols into his arms with a stolen knife, symbols that looked like the tribal markings some enslaved Africans carried, though Thomas had never seen such things before. The doctors called it brain fever, madness brought on by the heat. But everyone in Charleston knew the truth. The Delacroix family was cursed. And the curse wore a beautiful face and amber eyes. Nathaniel Beaumont died on July 15th. The physicians listed the cause as heart failure, but those who'd seen the body whispered different stories. They said his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. They said he'd clawed at his own chest so violently he'd drawn blood. They said his final words, gasped out to his horrified wife, were, she's coming for all of us." His funeral was attended by every important family in Charleston, a show of solidarity, a demonstration that the city's elite would not be cowed by superstition and fear. Richard Montrose stood at the graveside, looking gaunt and wild-eyed, barely acknowledging the condolences of other mourners. He'd lost everything. His wife had taken the children to Virginia and filed for divorce. His business partners had dissolved their arrangements, unwilling to associate with a man whose obsession had become Charleston's favorite scandal. His own brother refused to speak to him. But Richard didn't care about any of it. He cared only about Jeanne, about getting to her, about making her understand that he was different from the others, that his feelings were real, that if she'd just give him a chance. The delusion was perfect, complete. It never occurred to him that Jeanne had orchestrated every step of his destruction, that his feelings were exactly what she'd cultivated, that his downfall had been inevitable from the moment he'd first looked at her across that crowded auction platform. After the funeral, Richard went directly to the Delacroix mansion. He no longer bothered with pretense or social niceties. He simply walked up the front steps and pounded on the door with both fists. "Delacroix," he shouted. "I know you're in there. Open this door." No response. The mansion seemed to hold its breath, waiting. "I'll pay anything, everything I have left, everything I'll ever have. Just let me see her. Let me talk to her. 5 minutes, that's all I ask." The door opened. But it wasn't Philippe or any servant. It was Jeanne herself, standing in the entrance with afternoon light behind her, haloed in gold like some terrible angel. "Mr. Montrose," she said calmly, "you're making a scene." Richard stumbled forward, would have fallen if Jeanne hadn't steadied him. Her touch burned. He could feel it through his coat, through his shirt. That point of contact felt like hot iron pressed to his flesh. "I need to talk to you, please. Just 5 minutes." "Come inside, then, before the neighbors send for the constable." She led him through the mansion's interior. Richard noticed how empty it felt. Furniture covered with dust cloths, paintings removed from walls, carpets rolled and stacked in corners. The house was being abandoned from within, he realized. The Delacroix family was collapsing, and the mansion was collapsing with it. Jeanne brought him to the morning parlor, gestured for him to sit. He did, gripping the chair's arms to steady his shaking hands. "Where's Philippe?" he asked. "In his study, where he always is." Drinking himself to death, I imagine. Jeanne sat across from him, arranged her skirts with careful precision. "You wanted to talk, so talk." Richard opened his mouth, closed it. For 3 months he'd imagined this conversation, had rehearsed every word, but now, faced with her direct gaze, every prepared speech fled his mind. "Why?" he finally managed. "Why what, Mr. Montrose? Why destroy us? Why Charleston? Why any of this?" He leaned forward. "I know you're doing it deliberately. I know this isn't chance or coincidence. You're dismantling Charleston's elite families one by one, and I need to know why." Jeanne was silent for a long moment. Outside, thunder rumbled. Another storm approaching. The light in the parlor shifted, dimmed, turned everything grey and strange. Do you know what I was doing 15 years ago? She finally said. I was 7 years old, standing on an auction block in Port-au-Prince. They'd just torn me from my mother's arms. She was screaming. I was screaming. The traders were laughing, Mr. Montrose, because our pain was funny to them, because we weren't people. We were livestock, inventory, things to be sold and used and discarded. She stood, walked to the window, looked out at the gathering storm. They sold me to a French planter, Monsieur Duchamp. Do you know what he did to slave children, Mr. Montrose? Do you want me to describe it? The things that happened in that house, the things I saw, the things done to me. No, Richard whispered. Please, no, of course not. Because hearing about it might make you uncomfortable, might force you to confront what your comfortable life is built on. She turned back to him. Duchamp was the first to die. I was 12 years old when he put a pistol in his mouth during Sunday Mass. They blamed madness, brain fever, but I knew the truth. I'd spent 5 years learning how to break a man's mind, how to make him see what he'd done until he couldn't bear to keep living. After Duchamp came Levesque, then Beauchamp, then others. Different islands, different plantations, different families, but always the same lesson. Men like you, men who think ownership of human beings is their right, you're easy to destroy. Your pride makes you vulnerable. Your desire makes you stupid. Your certainty that you're special, that the rules don't apply to you, makes you walk straight into traps you should see from miles away. Richard felt something cold spread through his chest. You're insane. Am I? Or am I the only sane person in a world that's gone mad? Jeanne smiled, and it was the saddest expression Richard had ever seen. You built an entire civilization on slavery. You stole people from their homes, worked them to death, broke apart their families, denied them their humanity, and you thought there would be no consequences, that you could do this forever, that the universe didn't care. But the universe does care, Mr. Montrose, and sometimes it creates people like me. People who carry the weight of every scream, every lash, every separation, every rape, every murder committed in the name of profit. People who become vengeance itself. She moved closer, and Richard couldn't make himself retreat. You asked why, Charleston? Why these families? Because you're powerful, because you're respected, because destroying you sends a message that echoes further than destroying lesser men. When the Delacroix family falls, when the Beaumonts are ruined, when the Montroses are scattered, Charleston will remember. They'll whisper about it for generations. They'll tell the story of the slave woman who brought down dynasties, and maybe some master somewhere will think twice before striking his slave. Maybe some trader will hesitate before separating a mother from her child. Probably not. Probably nothing will change, but at least I'll have collected the debt. At least justice will have been served, even if it's only 3 families in one city out of thousands. She knelt before Richard's chair, looked up at him with those amber eyes that saw everything. Do you understand now? Do you see why I'm doing this? Richard did understand, and the understanding broke something fundamental inside him. Because she was right. Every word, every accusation. He'd built his fortune on human suffering and never once lost sleep over it. He'd bought and sold people like cattle. He'd separated families at auction. He'd ordered beatings for slaves who moved too slowly or spoke too freely or looked at him wrong. And he'd thought it was his right, his God-given right, sanctioned by law and custom and the comfortable belief that some people were simply worth less than others. What happens now? He asked hoarsely. Now you leave Charleston, tonight. You go as far away as you can and never come back. You change your name, you start over, you spend whatever life you have left trying to be better than what you were. Jeanne stood. Or you stay, and you end up like Beaumont, like Thomas Delacroix, like the dozen other men who couldn't walk away in time. And you? What happens to you? I finish what I started. The Delacroix family falls tonight. This house burns. Philippe and Celeste and every brick of this mansion turns to ash. And then I disappear. Someone else will buy me, someone in another city, another plantation, and the whole dance starts again. She moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing, Mr. Montrose. When you tell this story, and you will tell it in whatever new life you build, make sure people understand. I'm not unique. I'm not special. There are hundreds like me, thousands, scattered through every plantation, every household, every city where slavery exists. Most are too broken to fight back, but some of us, she smiled, some of us remember, some of us are patient, some of us are willing to burn the whole world down to balance the scales. That's the real terror, Mr. Montrose. Not that one slave woman destroyed 3 families in Charleston, but that she's not alone, that we're everywhere, that we're waiting, and that eventually, maybe not today, maybe not this year, but eventually, we'll remind you that the enslaved always outnumber the enslavers. We just haven't decided to act on it yet. She left him sitting in the parlor, mind reeling, as afternoon turned to evening and evening turned to night. Outside, the storm finally broke, lightning cracking across the sky, thunder shaking the house's foundations, rain hammering against windows with the fury of divine judgment. Richard Montrose stood on shaking legs, walked to the front door, looked back once at the mansion that would soon be ashes. Then he stepped out into the storm and started walking, away from Charleston, away from his old life, away from everything he'd been. Behind him, smoke began to rise from the Delacroix mansion's eastern wing. The fire started in Philippe's study. Later, investigators would say it was the oil lamp, knocked over by a drunk man's careless gesture. But those who'd seen the study afterward, those who'd witnessed the positioning of Philippe's body, the way his hands were clasped as if in prayer, the expression of almost relief on his burned face, they whispered different theories. They said Philippe Delacroix had started the fire himself, that in his final moments of clarity he'd understood what needed to happen, that he'd lit the flames and sat calmly while they consumed everything he'd built. The fire spread quickly. The mansion's old wood and multiple layers of paint fed the flames like kindling. By the time neighbors noticed the glow in the windows, by the time the fire brigade arrived with their hand-pumped engines and leather buckets, it was already too late. The entire eastern wing was engulfed. Flames shot from upper windows, smoke billowed black and thick, carrying with it the smell of burning everything, fabric and flesh, money and memory, 3 generations of accumulated wealth reduced to ash in a matter of hours. People gathered on East Battery Street, watching the spectacle with a mixture of horror and fascination. The city's elite stood in their nightclothes, faces painted orange by the firelight, watching one of Charleston's great houses burn to the waterline. "Where's the family?" someone asked. "Has anyone seen them?" Samuel the butler stood at the edge of the crowd, his face streaming with tears. "Master Philippe's inside. Madame Celeste too. She wouldn't leave. I tried to get her out, tried to make her see reason, but she just kept praying and praying and—" His voice broke. "Master Thomas is still in the asylum. He's the only one left." "And the slave? The woman from Saint-Domingue?" Samuel looked up, and something flickered across his face, something that might have been knowledge or might have been fear. "I don't know. Last I saw, she was in her room on the 3rd floor, but when I went back to get her," he shook his head. "The room was empty, door was locked from the inside, but she was gone, like she'd vanished into smoke." The whispers started immediately. "Witch, demon, curse." The crowd muttered and crossed themselves and watched the flames devour the Delacroix mansion while silently thanking God it wasn't their house burning, their family dying, their world ending. By dawn, only the mansion's brick walls remained, blackened and smoking. The fire brigade had managed to keep the flames from spreading to neighboring properties, but the Delacroix house itself was a total loss. 3 people dead, Philippe, Celeste, and a kitchen worker who tried to rescue them. Dozens more displaced, and 1 missing slave who'd seemingly disappeared into the night. The investigation took weeks, Magistrates reviewed property records, questioned witnesses, examined the ruins for evidence of arson. What they found was a story of financial collapse, debts Philippe had hidden, contracts he'd failed to honor, business ventures that had inexplicably fallen apart over the past few months. The Delacroix fortune, they discovered, was gone, completely gone. Philippe had mortgaged everything, trying to maintain appearances, had borrowed against future profits that never materialized, had made increasingly desperate deals with increasingly unscrupulous partners. The mansion's insurance wouldn't cover the debts. Thomas, discharged from the asylum to find himself orphaned and penniless, would inherit nothing but ashes and shame. The Delacroix name, once synonymous with wealth and power, had become a cautionary tale. The Beaumont family fared little better. Nathaniel's death had revealed his own financial maneuvering, the mortgaged properties, the loans called in, the business arrangements that had crumbled when his reputation failed. His wife Margaret sold their house on Trad Street and moved to Boston with whatever children would still speak to her. The Beaumont shipping empire was dismantled and sold for parts. And the Montroses. Richard had disappeared completely. Some said he'd gone to the frontier. Others claimed he'd sailed for Europe. A few whispered that he'd been seen in the Carolinas backcountry, working as a common laborer under a different name, haunted and hollow-eyed. His brother James inherited the Montrose properties, but the family's reputation had been destroyed. No one wanted to do business with the family that had produced a man who'd thrown away everything for an enslaved woman. Within a year, the Montrose plantations were sold. Within 2, the family had scattered across the colonies, carrying their shame like a curse. 3 families, 3 dynasties, all ruined within months of a single woman's arrival in Charleston. And Jeanne, she was never found. The magistrates searched, posted notices, offered rewards, interviewed every freed black person in Charleston, searched every ship that left the harbor in the weeks after the fire. But Jeanne had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. Some said she'd died in the fire, that her body had simply been too thoroughly burned to identify. Others claimed she'd escaped north, was already in Philadelphia or New York or Boston, starting the process again with a different name and a different set of families. The enslaved people of Charleston whispered a third possibility. They said Jeanne hadn't left at all, that she was still there, watching, waiting, that sometimes, if you looked carefully, you could see a woman with amber eyes moving through the crowds at market, or standing at the edge of the docks, or watching from the shadows of the auction block. They said she was checking, making sure Charleston remembered, making sure the lesson stuck. 5 years passed. Charleston slowly recovered from the scandal, though the 3 great houses remained empty and damaged, architectural reminders of what had happened. The city's elite rebuilt their fortunes, formed new partnerships, pretended the events of 1764 had been an aberration rather than a revelation. But things had changed, subtle things. Masters were slightly more careful with their slaves. Overseers held their whips with slightly less enthusiasm. When families were separated at auction, people looked away instead of watching with idle curiosity, not because they'd suddenly developed morality, but because they'd learned fear. They'd seen what could happen when the oppressed stopped accepting their oppression. They'd witnessed the power of patient vengeance. It wasn't much. It didn't end slavery or even significantly reduce its cruelties, but it was something. A small crack in the foundation of an evil system. A reminder that consequences existed, even if they took years to arrive. In 1769, a wealthy plantation owner in Savannah, Georgia, purchased a new slave to manage his household. She came with excellent references, educated, trained in the French manner, allegedly from a respectable estate in Charleston that had fallen on hard times. Her name was listed in the sale documents as Anne, but the other enslaved people in the household whispered a different name after the first week. They said when she looked at the master, her eyes changed color, from brown to something like amber or gold. They said she moved through the house at night when everyone was sleeping, and the next morning things would be slightly wrong. Portraits would be turned to face the wall, clocks would stop at the same time, mirrors would crack for no apparent reason. "It's starting again," they whispered. "She's starting again." And in the master bedroom, the plantation owner began having dreams. Dreams of fire, dreams of judgment, dreams of a woman with amber eyes who looked at him and saw every sin he'd ever committed, every cruelty, every moment of casual evil that had accumulated into a life built on human suffering. He would wake in cold sweats, heart pounding, and swear he could hear someone whispering in the darkness, "Remember, I remember everything." In Charleston, Thomas Delacroix lived in a rented room above a cobbler's shop on Queen Street. The madness had left him mostly, but he remained fragile, prone to fits of weeping, to long periods of staring at nothing. He worked as a clerk now, copying documents for lawyers, living on the charity of distant relatives who preferred to keep him at arm's length. Sometimes late at night, he would sit by his window and watch the street below. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, he would see a woman moving through the shadows, a woman whose walk he recognized, whose silhouette was burned into his memory. She would pause, look up, meet his eyes across the distance, and smile, that terrible, patient smile that said more clearly than words, "I'm still here. I'm still watching. The debt isn't fully paid yet." Then she would disappear into the darkness, and Thomas would sit shaking until dawn, wondering if he'd really seen her or if the madness was returning. He never told anyone. Who would believe him? Who would understand? In Boston, a woman received a letter sealed with red wax. She opened it carefully, read the contents, and smiled. The handwriting was familiar. She'd received similar letters before, from Havana and Kingston and Bridgetown and a dozen other ports where slavery flourished. The letter contained no signature, no return address. But the message was clear. Charleston was finished. 3 families destroyed. The lesson delivered. Time to move to the next city, the next set of targets, the next chapter in a war that had been ongoing for centuries and would continue for centuries more. The woman, whose name was sometimes Sarah, sometimes Elizabeth, sometimes Marie, depending on which household she served, placed the letter in a small wooden box with dozens of others. Letters from women like herself, women who remembered, women who'd been forged by cruelty into something sharp and terrible and necessary. She locked the box, hid it beneath the floorboards of her small room, and went downstairs to serve breakfast to the wealthy merchant who thought he owned her, who had no idea what lived in his house, who would soon learn the same lesson Philippe Delacroix and Nathaniel Beaumont and Richard Montrose had learned, that some debts could never be forgiven, only collected. And somewhere, moving through the American colonies like a whisper of smoke, Jeanne continued her work. She would be sold again, would enter another household, would watch and wait and judge, and when the time was right, when the pieces were in position, she would begin the careful process of dismantling another set of lives built on human suffering. They called her cursed. They called her a witch. They called her a demon wearing the face of grace. But history, real history, the kind written in blood and fire, and the patient vengeance of the oppressed, history called her something else. History called her justice, imperfect, terrible, devastating justice, but justice nonetheless. And in Charleston, where the ruins of 3 great houses still stood as monuments to what had happened, people would gather sometimes and tell the story of Jeanne, the most dangerous woman in the American colonies, the story of how one enslaved woman had brought down dynasties. They told it as a warning, as entertainment, as a ghost story to frighten children. But the enslaved people listening would hear something different in that story. They would hear a promise. They would hear proof that resistance was possible, that justice could be served, that the powerful were not as invulnerable as they pretended. And on certain nights, when the moon was dark and the city was quiet, they would whisper prayers, not to the Christian God their masters worshipped, but to older powers, African powers, Caribbean powers. Powers that remembered when humans were treated as humans, before the ships came, before the chains, before the auction blocks. They would pray for patience, for precision, for the perfect moment when the scales would finally balance, and sometimes, not often but sometimes, those prayers were answered, in the form of a woman with amber eyes, in the form of justice deferred but never forgotten, in the form of fire.